Hi guys, welcome to the Watch Hobbyist channel. So I've recently purchased this Daytona, as you may have seen in another video, and the watch was basically the most difficult watch I have ever bought. Not because of finding one, but actually because it was so difficult to find the right one. That's the key thing. It's not always difficult to find watches, but just don't go buying the first one you see. So I wanted to give you some tips on how to go about buying a vintage watch. What is vintage? And I wanted to give you some, advice from my research and my whole experience of actually purchasing this watch and various others as well, and what I've learned along the way, because it is a bit of a journey when you start getting into this side of watches. So first of all, what is vintage? Well, I believe it originally came from wine collectors and people like that who would call a wine vintage, 2004 vintage or 2001 vintage, that type of thing. It should really have a year associated with it. I've also heard people say that vintage is anything over 25 years old. There's various forms of what people see as vintage, so it's a bit of a funny term that doesn't really mean too much in some regards. So it's something therefore that is, whatever's in your mind is vintage, basically. Is it an old watch? Is it a really classy watch that's a few years old? Is it, it's always going to have some age to it, but then I suppose you could go and buy a vintage 2015 vintage wine, which would only be at this point 1 year old. So we'll call these watches vintage for now anyway, because it just makes the whole thing easier. However, I want you to know that buying a vintage watch is nothing like buying a new watch. Absolutely, in my experience, nothing like it. If you go and buy a new watch, what do? You go to the local shopping centre that's got an authorised dealer of the brand that you want, say Omega or a Rolex or Longines or whoever, even Casio, whatever, and you go to the shop and you buy the watch. If you don't buy it and you start going around different shops that sell the same watch, you're probably only doing that to receive the best deal. You're probably not doing it because you're looking at the actual aspects of one watch versus another, because when they're brand new, obviously they go through quality control and they should all really be the same. I'm not saying that they are, but they should be. So therefore, you're only doing that to get the best deal, procure the best deal. You're not doing it to actually look at different aspects of the watch. Now with vintage, that's totally not the case. If you go and see your vintage watch and you find that there are aspects of the dial that have marks, or you have, bracelets that don't match, or bezels that are too marked, then generally my advice would be to either walk away or get it at the price that it should be, with some restoration involved or that type of thing. So therefore it's not the same as just walking into a shop to buy a brand new watch. The only thing is that these watches are rare, so walking away is sometimes difficult. It's not always an easy task to have searched for so long for a watch. Maybe, some people would see a week as a long time, some people would see a year as a long time. You might have searched for a long time, and then, to find it's not quite right is really disappointing. And I have been through that a couple of times where I've thought I've found a really good example of something to add to my collection that I will wear, that I will really enjoy owning, and then actually there's been something drastically changed on it. Now actually I saw a watch recently. I picked up a Speedmaster, which somebody kindly sent me to look at before I actually paid for it. And when I received it and I compared it to all my reference books and things like that, I was amazed at how many points I could pick up on that had been changed on this watch. Now that's when you get what's called a Franken watch. So it may have an original dial from an older model, it may have an original bezel from a newer model, the case might be incorrect, but all the parts are original and actual, genuine to the brand. So in that case it was an Omega Speedmaster, so they were Omega parts, they were purchased from Omega. However, in terms of collecting, they were no good, because you can't just throw a load of original parts together and then expect the value to be the same as something that is bought from one person, has all its box and papers and everything, has never been changed, has never been over polished, that type of thing. So all these terms that I'm going through now, I will go through, what I actually mean by them as well. Now, the great thing about vintage watches that I have found is that prices are generally, overall, a lot less money than modern watches. It's becoming a bit tedious to me with modern watches, which is why I've got more back into the vintage side of things. vintage watches, you can pick up a really great watch, you know, for what it is, for its movement or for its looks or what have you, and you can pay a lot less money than something that is currently out there because it's being marketed and you've got all the dealer markup and this and that and this. So it's really nice to be able to still afford watches when you start looking at vintage watches. We all have a finite amount of money, and it can be very difficult sometimes to actually procure the amount of watches that you want in the new world versus the vintage world. However, what I always say to people is, it's the old analogy of the old sports car. So you go to buy, say, for example, a Mercedes SL, okay, and you can still go and buy a brand new Mercedes SL for about £100,000, for example. However, there are used ones on the market that are maybe 10 years old and probably not even a tenth of the original cost. But you go and buy that car, and if there's something wrong with it, that's when you realise that you could afford the car, but could you actually afford the running costs? Because the parts can sometimes be as dear as the new model. You know, if you need a new air compressor for your air conditioning, that would probably cost you hundreds and hundreds of pounds, if not thousands of pounds, versus, you know, which now becomes a massive percentage of the actual car. And that can be very much the same with vintage watches, because the parts are obviously rarer, they're fewer and far between, and sometimes what is a good idea actually is to purchase a really battered example of the same watch. If it's a watch that you really love owning, this vintage watch, and you want to make sure that you've got parts available, you know, for many years to come, then sometimes if you go and buy sort of a really old movement or a really old battered example of the same watch that would probably not be worn but would be used for donor parts, then that can be a good idea as well. However, in general, if you stick to the big brands, then the parts are mostly available. So you would obviously have to check that depending on each watch, but Omega, they have a very good resource of parts. The only thing is that Omega have actually recently stopped allowing independents to access their parts resources. So there are companies out there that have stocks of parts, such as Cousins here in the UK and Offray in the US. They have their own stocks of parts that they've purchased previously, but once those stocks run out, then actually I believe that the only way you're going to be able to get Omegas repaired successfully is via Omega themselves or Omega authorised service centres, you know, certified service centres, which we do have one here in the UK called STS, Swiss Time Services, which have dealings with myself, and they're really good. So that's you know, some of the pitfalls with vintage watches. Now, when you actually come to purchasing a vintage watch, like I say, it's not like buying a new one. The details are really the key thing to how much you will pay for a watch. So you could find a Rolex Daytona 6239 like that. If it has basically a hugely polished case, so there's barely any lugs left, and it has a battered bezel, and it has marks on the dial, and the hands, the luminescence of the hands don't match the dial markers and things like that, then you would expect to pay a lot less for that one than one such as this, which is very, very much in excellent condition. The dial has no marks to it, everything matches up, everything is nice and strong in terms of lugs, you know, there's not been too much polishing going on and things like that. It's these little key details that are so important. So what do I mean by that? Well, first of all, so say you have a brand new watch right now, and a couple of years down the line you want to get it serviced, so you send it into the manufacturer, and they say to you it's going to cost you £300 to £400 to service this watch. And while it's in with us, what we can do is we can replace the hands, so that you know, in case the luminescence is failing in any way, and we can also replace the dial because we think it'd benefit from a new dial, and we can polish it for you as well. And that's all within the cost, you know, so you don't have to worry about paying any extra. It's all included within that price. So a lot of people go for that because they see it as a free service, whereas actually it's not. You're still paying for it, it's just that they offer that within the service. Now, that's fine if you aren't ever going to become a collector. However, what collectors really look for is originality. Just like cars, anything like that, anything vintage, anything old, we'll look for originality, because the idea of purchasing something that looks as it was when it was brand new is always something that's intriguing and something that's appealing. And some people are the opposite. Some people want a watch that's absolutely battered, you know, and just looks like it's been through a war, literally in terms of mil subs and you know, military watches basically. However, even then you still look for good strong cases that generally haven't been polished and things like that, because you know, if it's got dings and scars and battle marks, then that's what people actually want to see. So it's not always about the condition of the case. You know, some people actually don't mind an absolutely battered watch because they prefer it because the watch has had a life. However, the things that do really need to generally be in very good condition are dials and hands. So anything within inside the watch. This watch actually has a domed crystal, which is very unusual. You usually find them with flat service crystals, whereas this is the original crystal. So things like that can still make a difference to the value, because you don't tend to find them very often. Now the dial on this watch is a good example, because it's mark free. There's no marks. If you buy yourself a loop, which I would definitely recommend getting into vintage watches, something like this, which is actually basically a magnifying glass, and this particular one I paid about £6 for it on Amazon, and you can see it actually has two little LEDs there. Now you've got to be careful with that. So when you're looking at watches, they have a lot of reflective parts, and you start looking through a 40 times loop with LEDs involved, and it can actually damage your eyes. You've got to be careful. However, I would recommend something like that even if you don't use the LEDs, because you can look much closer in detail at the watch, and when you're there and you're buying the watch, you know, you want to have the tools with you that are going to enable you to either get the better deal because you found something, or walk away from it because it's not the watch you're looking for. So clean dial, very, very important. What's also important is that parts haven't been replaced, as I say. So around this dial we have little luminescent markers around the edge of the batons, so they go all the way around the dial. And actually the hands also have some luminescence to them as well. Now the lume doesn't actually work anymore because it's tritium and it stopped glowing a long time ago. So when you charge it in the light, it doesn't actually do anything, and that's fine, because that also shows originality, because the older a dial is, the less likely it is to glow. So therefore this should be the original dial, because it doesn't do anything at all. And the hands are exactly the same. Now the other thing as well is the hands luminescence is actually an identical colour to what is around the batons on the dial. So that is a very important thing, because it means that the hands have never been replaced. The dial and the hands are together, you know, as original, and that is something that is very important to collectors. You should really be looking for things like that. In fact, all these watches have original luminescence that matches up completely. So for example, this Tissot here also has the same colours going on the hands as it does the dial. You can't always tell on a camera, by the way. Sometimes it changes it seems to affect the colour because of the exposure, but however in reality they are absolutely identical. Now that's really the main things that you need to be looking for with condition, is the dial, the matching lume. If it's been over polished, so like I was saying before, when you send a watch in for service, they'll sometimes say to you, do you want us to polish it, you know, and offer it as a free service. Now you can tell generally if something's been polished by comparing it to pictures, and I'd say if you haven't looked at any other pictures, you need to be, so you know what's what with a watch. But sometimes they start to polish the lugs here. So the lugs are at the end of the watch head, and they're what hold the strap in place, or the bracelet in this case. And they shouldn't be too thin. They should be about sort of this thickness plus, and they shouldn't be beveled over the top. Now I've seen it where some people have said, oh, this watch has never been polished because it's got thick lugs along this side, but if you look at it, actually they have a very sort of warped look to them because they've not been polished very well on the top. And you know, there are definitely skills involved with polishing. People can spend 20 years learning how to polish things truly, you know, to original specification. So it's something that should really be done only by an expert. I see a lot of these people that buy sort of Gary Flex blocks and polishing machines at home, thinking they'll just make a watch look like new, and they absolutely ruin the value of it for the future because they just make an absolute mess of it. Again, another watch that has a really sort of clean dial, no marks to it. There's actually no luminescence on this at all, but it's a really good quality dial, you know, so something that's very important. And another thing to look for actually in regards to the luminescence, which is very important, is how fluffy it is. So when it's first applied, it's sort of quite a nice, neat application in general. If you have, say, a Rolex Submariner dial that has like the triangle at the top, the luminescence will fall very neatly within that triangle. It's like a luminous paint that's put on top, and it won't generally sort of fall outside of the triangle if it's been done at the factory. Now, I've seen some dials where they've been relumed and stated that they haven't been. However, the luminescence under a loupe or under a macro lens of a camera, you can clearly see where it's really not even slightly. You know, it needs to be an even amount of lume. And also, it's nice for it to change colour. That's called patina, and people actually like that. I don't know if I'll have done this video at this point, but the Seamaster 300 Spectre actually has a current type of lume, which is called Super Luminova, but it's actually coloured to look like a vintage luminescence that's actually changed colour, because current Luminova doesn't actually change colour over time, whereas older tritium, radium, it really does change. Now, tritium looks really nice when it's sort of a creamy colour, or it sometimes goes like a golden yellow colour. However, when it goes a really, really dark brown colour, that can sometimes, I believe, relate to moisture ingress. And also, like I said before, with the luminescence not being totally neat and you know, within sort of boundaries of what it should be, that can also relate to when there's been moisture inside the watch, and therefore there can also be issues relating to corrosion on the dial and things like that. So something to be very, very careful of, something to be, you know, very aware of, is little pointers like that that show you what's happened to that watch over the years. You know, because unless you know the original owner of that watch, you're never going to know the true story throughout its life. So you've got to, you know, you've got to become a detective basically when you buy things like this. Box and papers is something that I get asked about. You know, should it have a box and papers? Well, I can tell you now that out of all these watches, only 2 of them have a box, and not one of them has papers. Now, I've purchased them all from people that I trust and I know, and therefore, you know, for me that's absolutely fine. If I was buying a modern watch, I would only buy it with papers, but over the years things get lost, so it can be forgiven on a much older watch to a degree. You know, if you're buying it from Dodgy Dave down in your local town, then, you know, maybe be wary, because the last thing you want to happen is you send the watch in for service and it flags up as stolen. However, I know that these have all been checked and things like that, so I'm not concerned. Boxes and papers are 2 totally different things. It's quite often a term that's used, but really, what's a box? What difference does a box make? You know, it's nice to have it, but what's to suggest that that box is original to the watch? Why aren't the papers there? A box, you know, it really means nothing. You could go and buy any old watch, and then you could purchase a box that goes with it from somewhere like eBay now, and just pair it together and say it comes with its original box. I never ever believe a watch that says original box only. I never believe it when it's the original box, because it could just be anything that's been procured from somewhere like eBay or Craigslist or Gumtree here in the UK, that type of thing. You know, to me that means nothing. It's all about the watch. Unless it's got papers with it, you know, the papers are more important than a box. But even then, the papers, not necessarily counterfeit, but the papers can be misjudged as a bonus, because back in those days the paperwork would actually just be a blank piece of paper in some cases. Sometimes they were punched, they had like punched holes in them for security, but a lot of them were actually just blank pieces of paper or booklets. And in fact, I have this here. Now, this shows you how it would be. Now, it has the jeweller's stamp, okay, and it has the details of one of my watches, which isn't in this video. What's to say that somebody couldn't have found one of these booklets, written on the back of it, and hey presto, you've got a watch with papers. You know, that's literally as easy as it could be. So it's something that should be taken with a pinch of salt. If you know who you're buying it from and you think you can trust it, then great. But you know, modern day watches come with cards that are totally related to the watch, and when they are counterfeited, you can really generally tell because the font isn't the same, or it's just not done absolutely correctly, basically. Whereas old pieces of paper, I don't know if you can tell whether ink from pens looks old or not. I've never looked into it that much. It's something to just be aware of, that people can just write things on a piece of paper and say it's got the original papers. Now, where do you buy vintage watches? There are plenty of ways of buying anything these days. In 2016, we have eBay, we have Gumtree, we have Craigslist, we have dealers, we have forums, we have so many different outlets, so many different options for people to purchase watches, and only some of those are trustworthy. Now, do you buy a watch off eBay? Well, of course, there's always the stories of watches that came from eBay and turned out to be real gems. It's not to say you can't buy a decent watch off eBay, but it's definitely something that you would be more wary buying it off eBay than you would be buying it from somebody who's trusted in the watch community. So when I say trust in the watch community, I can mean either a private seller, which is actually where I picked up my watch. I picked it up from a well-known collector, and therefore I know he's done his research. I've backed that up by doing my research, and he purchased it from a very well-known dealer in America who only seems to sell absolutely incredible quality of watches. So that is that we've now got provenance, we've got therefore history of the watch, because we know a little bit of its timeline, and we know it's only been in the hands of good people. If you go buying it from eBay, you usually get sort of very poor quality pictures, you get poor quality description, and that's not always the person selling the watch's fault. They may genuinely not know what they have, but it's always a bit disconcerting when you're buying something that's several £1,000s or what have you from eBay. I'm not saying it's a bad resource, but you just need to take with a pinch of salt what is on there. I once replied to somebody on a forum because they had actually chosen to really take interest in a watch, and I just pointed out that firstly things like the bracelet didn't look correct to me, and the description was very vague, and it mentioned something about the watch being left from his grandfather to him, so therefore I'm sure that people use that as a get out clause should they be found to be selling a counterfeit watch or what have you. And you just got to have enough information to make you feel comfortable. You don't have to buy a watch. A watch is basically a toy. We don't even use watches that much for telling the time. In 2016, a lot of kids now use just their phones. So don't go spending money because you feel that you found the right thing and you have to buy it, because you really don't. You buy from the right places. So the right places, in my opinion, are not eBay, not Gumtree, not Craigslist, although I do have the odd look on there. I personally think dealers are the best way, but only dealers that are known to sell this sort of stuff. If you're buying from a dealer that generally sells modern stuff and then suddenly decides to start selling the odd vintage watch, well, again, have they done their research? You back to that stage. Forums are a very good place to look, because maybe not always generalized forums, but sort of specific forums like Amiga forums, Rolex forums. If you type those searches into Google, you will come up with specific forums, and what you can do then is you can actually look at the you can look at the username of the person, you can see what they've sold in the past, you can see their posts, you can see what they've written about, and you can see if they actually have any knowledge on the subject. You can find out some information about them, and therefore you can work out if they're a trustworthy source of buying a watch. That is a very interesting and good option, because forums allow you to do that. There's also a very key thing in terms of research which you should be doing. Now, I always recommend books. Okay, now you can certainly use the internet, but for me there are only a very, very small number of websites that give actual great information. There was a story recently where a very well-known blog who started selling watches actually ended up where people were stating that they're selling a Franken watch, which I was talking about before, where it's got various parts from various different models. And they're a really trustworthy, regarded source, and yet they've messed up and have possibly, according to the internet, managed to sell a watch that shouldn't have been together. So these websites are not always the best source. A book is also not always the best source because they can make mistakes. However, I would trust a person that's researched a book and written one over, say, 2 or 3 years over someone that's taken 4 hours to create a blog post that goes onto the internet and suddenly becomes what everybody looks towards in terms of buying a watch. So for Amiga, I would recommend this book. Now, this is specifically on the Speedmaster. There are obviously other Amiga books out there. However, I can't do anything but recommend this book. It's called Moonwatch Only. It's by Greg and Anthony, who I met at Basel World this year, 2016, and I've interviewed them, and that's coming up soon. However, it's not for that reason I'm recommending this book. I actually got in touch with them when I heard about this book because I knew what a Bible it's supposed to be, and when I read it, I was exactly right. I couldn't believe the amount of detail that they've gone into, the amount of pictures that are in there, the amount of text, the amount of things that just sort of make so much sense when you suddenly start seeing these Franken watches, because you've got this absolute concise reference to compare everything to. They've used information from everywhere, every source, and made sure it's all correct. So this is definitely the most concise reference you would be able to find on the Speedmasters. For other Amiga, there are plenty of other books out there, but for the Speedmaster you won't get any better, I assure you. And this is definitely a book I'd recommend for vintage Rolex models. So this is the sports models, obviously, as the title suggests. It's by Martin Skeet and Nick Url. And I used this book when I was referencing the 6239 Daytona, and I've used it when I've been looking at other vintage models in the past. It's got the Explorers, it's got Submariners, it's got GMTs, Daytonas, Milgaus, all the old models. There's quite a lot of pictures, there's quite a lot of detail. It's not quite as detailed as other books such as Moonwatch Only, which I recommended for Amiga, but it's certainly one of the best vintage Rolex books that I've seen personally. There may be others out there, but for me this is the one I'd definitely recommend from my collection. And finally, what I wanted to talk about as well is the quality of watches. So just remember that back in the day, production was not like it is now. The quality control and things like that, they were not up to the standards of 2016. If you go buying a vintage watch, they rattle, they generally don't feel as heavy, they're made out of thinner steels, they're made out of different materials, but to me, if a watch has lasted that long, then it's still a very good quality item. And just because it doesn't feel heavy, or it doesn't feel this, or it doesn't feel that, doesn't particularly mean anything. It's just a different perception of what quality in 2016 resembles versus 1950, say. Just think of an old car. You know, if you get in a 1950s Ferrari or 1960s Ferrari, and then you get in a modern one, then you would hope there's quite a jump in quality perception. However, that car has still lasted, it's still going, and you know that makes it, in my opinion, still a quality item. So I hope this guide has given you some ideas and some thoughts and some pointers as to the journey that is buying vintage watches. It's not a simple step. It's not really a step, in my opinion, that should be taken by new people to the watch world, but people that have really been owning and investing and collecting watches for a while. And I hope you enjoyed the video. Please make sure you subscribe to my Watch Hobbyist channel, and also Instagram.com/WatchHobbyist. Thanks, and I'll see you again soon.